Good evening. For my final presentation, I would like to talk about an important individual that lived in America during the Second Great Awakening. Now, as historians, we have to be honest and objective in our research. So in finding someone to research for this final project, it was actually a little bit of a hard work for me to try to decide on someone that had a very important impact on American Christianity. Now, in leading up to who I want to discuss, when you look at the history of missions, both in the United States and in foreign missions, I feel that one of the most interesting ideas or focus of missions to look at, and I believe also the evidence concurs with that, is that of the Methodist circuit rider during the Great Awakening. The courage and humility that these few men possessed in order to just drop everything, drop their complete lifestyles to go load up what few possessions they had on a horse and travel thousands to hundreds of thousands of miles in order to preach the gospel and take the gospel to the rugged frontier in the wilderness is amazing to me. And what I think is even more amazing in that of itself is not only just their courage and humility, is also just the dangers that they faced that didn't faze them, be it flash floods or, countless wild animals or harrowing experiences that they could have faced. And I feel like that is through that's what made their impact even more amazing during the Second Great Awakening. And it is with that I would like to bring you to the focus of my topic for this presentation, and that is the life and ministry of Peter Cartwright, also known as the Lord's Plowman or the Backwoods Preacher, according to his autobiography, which you'll see in my bibliography. Now, it is my point in this presentation to show that it is through Peter Cartwright's upbringing and his preaching style that many in the frontier especially and out west can thank Peter Cartwright and the circuit riding preachers for the biblical background that America was blessed with in the 19th and the early 20th century. Now, in looking at my first point, it takes me to Peter Cartwright's upbringing. And when you look at his upbringing, I think that was one of the things that benefited him so much for his ministry, as Peter Cartwright was born in 1785 and grew up for most of his childhood in the rough and tumble backcountry of Kentucky, according to Robert Bray's work that is also in my bibliography. Now, because he grew up in a rough and tumble country, he was more of that type of a kid. He didn't grow up being saved, even though he grew up in a Methodist household. And though he got saved at the age of 15, 16, which I'll talk about later, I believe it's that childhood that actually led him to be successful in his work, because as his later ministry would show, as he spent many, many years embracing the rough and rugged backcountry of both Kentucky and Illinois. And I think that his rugged upbringing is one thing that benefited him for that. And according to the article from his autobiography, he would commonly go without food, or he wouldn't have very much food, or he wouldn't have any money. Yet this didn't despair him, I think, because according to his autobiography, because he grew up in the woods, that left him better suited to take the gospel through that rugged backcountry. And the second point that I think his rugged upbringing helped him in his ministry is that, interestingly enough, he was a preacher that was not one to back down from a fight. The article, I believe, is by Mark Teasdale in my bibliography. It stated that quite often, rugged people would come in with every intention of breaking up Peter Cartwright's service or his revival service. And is included in that article is that one man intent on breaking it up invited him, tried to invite him out for a fight, and Peter Cartwright, said, "All right, let's go do it." And I think it's that unusual force that he did not back down from a fight. He was there, and he was not going to let anything deter him from preaching God's word that led him to be such a successful preacher in the backcountry and be successful in leading so many to Christ. Now, my second point that I would like to discuss is the effect of his preaching. Now, Peter Cartwright, according to article on bibliography, Peter Cartwright and Charisma, he was a very charismatic, energetic preacher. His sermons were largely participatory, extemporaneous, and anecdotal. And with that, he used, as I said, it was participatory. He used participants highly in order to create the scenes to show the audience the setting needed for that dramatic conversion, which I believe stemmed from he had a very dramatic conversion himself. At the age of 15, he was brought to Christ at a camp revival, much as the famous Cane Ridge revival. And at that camp meeting, he experienced a dramatic conversion to Christ, and that, I believe, according to his bibliography, shows that that influenced his preaching. And because of that participatory and that charismatic and the very energetic style of preaching, he was able to lead large amounts of people to the gospel. As the article or the work by Robert Bray states, that in his years of ministry, it is assumed that or not assumed, it is said that he reached over 10,000 souls for Christ. Now, I know in my own life that leading just maybe one or two to the Lord, that in itself is a great milestone. But imagine leading 10,000 souls to Christ. And I believe that had to do with his energetic preaching style. As Peter Cartwright himself stated in his autobiography, that he wasn't educated or a minister that was prepared that way. He pursued a divine calling from God, and that's what got him ordained into the ministry. Was his methods and his preaching style was what actually got him ordained by Francis Asbury. As Francis Asbury, as it shows in Frank Woodward's article that's also in my bibliography, that Francis Asbury saw in Peter Cartwright and a few of those other circuit riding preachers, a man who could fulfill Asbury's dream of putting the gospel, as is quoted in our textbook from Mark Knoll, that to put the gospel into every kitchen, every log cabin, addressing the aged and the young, and fulfilling also what says in Matthew 28:19 and 20, to go preach the gospel to every creature. And Peter Carr embodied that very, very well, as he was a ordained minister and preaching on the circuit riding ministry before he was 20 years old. And he remained faithful to that, and that which brings us to my third point, in that Peter Cartwright remained faithful to his calling through the years. Now, as I said, according to his autobiography, Peter Cartwright was ordained before he was 20 years old. And he immediately, he was out preaching the gospel and on the road continually, facing the dangers, battling flash floods, wild animals, as well as the rough and rowdies in his camp meetings. And he would preach as many times as he could, maybe 5-6 times a day, according to the article by Charity Carney in my bibliography. Now, this was never easy on him, but he never despaired. Even when slavery issues forced him out of Kentucky, and he chose to move with his family to Illinois, he continued his circuit riding ministry and continued to preach the gospel and pursue the calling for promoting Methodist and Christian education, which led to the foundation of 2 universities that are still very famous today, so that people could grow up learning Christian education and be prepared to go out for the ministry. Because at the time when Peter Cartwright grew up, there was pretty much only the New England Primer available. But as he grew and he remained faithful, much more Christian books and came into education as a result. Now, according to Edward Eggleston's work, he continued to preach with a fervor and was president of the Methodist association in that area of Illinois for over 50 years, preaching 15,000 sermons or during that time, clear up until his death. His fervor remained strong, even though he had distractions such as politics. He was always strong against slavery. The research shows that he was always super fervent and driven to preach that gospel and put that gospel in every corner of Illinois. He stated in his autobiography that his mission field, his area or his church in Illinois was an area of over 400 square miles, which is just flat out amazing that he could minister to that many people. So it's because of those reasons that I believe Peter Cartwright was such a highly important minister in during the Second Great Awakening in the 1800s, because many brave men were circuit riders who preached for Christ, but I don't think they had the effect that Peter Cartwright had. His rough and rugged upbringing, which led him to be able to pursue souls for Christ even through the direst of circumstances, his energetic preaching style, which led so many souls to Christ, and his faith in continuing throughout the years, is how many Americans, especially on the frontier, can thank Peter Cartwright for his efforts and preaching during the time of the Second Great Awakening, and can thank him for having such a biblical background during the 1800s and the 1900s.